Welcome to the Voice of the Beginning, the Word of the Bible. Before we begin, help us spread the word. Subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share with those you love.
We begin our journey not with a shout of triumph or the arrogance of one seeking recognition, but with the deep and reverent whisper of modesty. Paul the Apostle to the nations, the one who planted churches and stood before empires, now finds himself in a sacred dilemma, where the glory of God manifests in a way so vast and overwhelming that any trace of human pride becomes a direct offense to the holiness of the Creator. In recounting his experience, he chooses the path of self-denial and speaks of himself in the third person, as if the man caught up to the heights was someone distinct from the man who now writes with trembling hands. This distancing is not a mere rhetorical device, but a necessity of a soul desiring to protect the purity of the revelation, removing his own ego from the indescribable magnitude of what he witnessed in the heavenly realms. The tone permeating this moment is one of a reverence that paralyzes the senses, carefully preparing the listener's heart to understand that the greatest spiritual experiences are not born of intellectual effort or human will, but rather from a sovereign and incomprehensible divine election. It is the definitive recognition that we are but jars of clay, fragile and imperfect vessels carrying eternal and infinite treasures within. Paul understands that, in the economy of the kingdom of God, the path to the heights necessarily passes through the lowest place. Before being worthy to ascend to the third heaven and behold the spheres where the light of God is the very air one breathes, a man must first descend to the soil of absolute humility, prostrating himself in the dust of the earth, where the noise of the self finally falls silent, so that the voice of the Spirit can echo with clarity. It is in this emptying of oneself that the journey begins, for only a soul stripped of vanity can endure the weight of glory without being consumed by it. Paul's silence regarding the immediate details serves as an invitation for each of us to step down from our own pedestals, recognizing that proximity to the sacred requires a broken heart and a spirit that does not seek to shine on its own, but only to reflect the light of the one who dwells in eternity. There was a nameless and eternal moment, when the fundamental laws of time and space completely lost their grip and authority over the Apostle's soul, crumbling before the absolute sovereignty of the supernatural that summoned him. Paul plunges into a dimension unknown to the logical mind, where the clock of human existence ceases to pulse, and physical extension stops being a frontier, becoming instead a vague and distant memory. He himself confesses, with a humility bordering on awe, that he does not know whether this journey occurred in the body or out of the body, and this sacred uncertainty is by no means a lapse in memory or mental confusion, but rather the purest and most crystalline proof of the Spirit's authenticity in the face of overwhelming glory. When the divine touches the human with such intensity, the definitions of matter become irrelevant, and the limited logic of the senses is suspended in favor of a much higher perception, where the soul sees without eyes and hears without fleshly ears. This rapture functions as the deep sigh of a soul that, profoundly weary of the limitations imposed by the flesh and the heavy chains of finitude, suddenly finds itself drawn by an irresistible celestial magnetism emanating directly from the throne of the Creator. Imagine for a moment the staggering sensation of leaving behind, in the blink of an eye, the oppressive weight of gravity that binds us to the dust, the chronic pains of the world that fatigue us, and the persistent shadows of doubt that cloud earthly vision. It is an absolute and glorious detachment where human consciousness expands far beyond the five known senses, breaking through the barriers of the intellect, so that what was once physical and dense becomes pure light and spiritual vibration in perfect harmony with eternity. Paul does not walk on his own legs, nor move by his own breath, but is led and carried by an omnipotent force that asks no permission and follows no human protocols, yet in return offers an oceanic freedom that the earth with all its treasures and pleasures has never known and can never provide. This is a rapture of pure love, a divine kidnapping of consciousness that transports him beyond the veil, separating the visible from the invisible, the mortal from the immortal, the ephemeral from that which will never pass away. in this state of profound ecstasy. Paul's soul is like a drop of water being drawn back into the infinite ocean of God, where individuality is not lost in a void, but finds itself fully by being enveloped in the majestic presence that sustains every atom of the universe. Every fiber of his spiritual being vibrates at a frequency of peace that surpasses all understanding, while the world of men with its empires and conflicts is left behind, like a pale and tiny memory, too small to contain the immensity of what is about to be revealed in the crystal palaces of eternity. He experiences the transition from the corruptible to the incorruptible feeling, the texture of a glory that does not burn, but heals, and that does not blind but opens the eyes of the heart to the reality that was always there, hidden by the curtain of matter. It is the beginning of an ascent with no return to his former condition. For no one who touches the hem of God's garment in the third heaven can return to the world as the same person. Paul's ascent must not be understood as a mere physical displacement through the clouds, but rather as a profound and gradual rise through increasing levels of glory and holiness. He traverses the layers of existence like one climbing a staircase of light, where each step reveals a new face of the Creator's sovereignty. First, he leaves behind the first heaven, that blue vault that envelops the world of men, where birds fly in freedom and clouds dance under the command of the winds, a realm that, though beautiful, is still touched by the finitude of the earth. Continuing his upward trajectory, he surpasses the second heaven, the vast and silent firmament where stars and galaxies proclaim the geometric order of the cosmos and the supreme intelligence of the One who named them a sphere where the immensity of space makes man seem like a grain of sand, yet still remains part of the visible creation. And then, in a leap of faith and divine power, he finally reaches the third heaven. This is not a place measured by miles, but by purity. It is the direct dwelling of the presence, the resplendent atrium of the throne where light has no external source because it emanates from God himself. Paul crosses the deepest dimensions of creation until he reaches the critical point where time stops pulsing, and eternity becomes the only available breath. Each stage of this miraculous ascent represents a necessary stripping away of earthly illusions and the trivial concerns that would bind any human being to the soil. In the third heaven, the atmosphere is so dense and charged with absolute holiness that it acts as a purifying fire, instantly burning away everything that is impure, selfish, or carnal, while illuminating with an unbearable clarity everything that is eternal and true. This is the dimension of ultimate reality, the foundation of all things, where Paul understands in a single glance that everything we see, touch, and value here on earth is but a pale shadow, a distorted reflection of the true substance that resides on high. There, beauty is not a concept, it is a person. Truth is not a doctrine, it is the environment. He contemplates the matrix of life and perceives that the material world is only the echo of a song that sings continuously in the corridors of this inaccessible glory, where the presence of the Most High fills every empty space, leaving no room for anything other than the purest worship and the recognition that he is all in all. Crossing the threshold of paradise. Paul does not merely encounter a bucolic landscape or a garden of visual delights as the limited human mind might imagine, but rather the pulsing, vibrant center of all divine harmony, the incandescent core where all life finds its original meaning and its reason for being. There, in that environment saturated with a glory that cannot be measured, he is enveloped by voices, symphonies, and sounds that defy any attempt at human recording or cataloguing. He hears ineffable words, expressions of a celestial language that possesses no translation, rhyme, or correspondence in the poor and limited idioms of men. These are pure frequencies of absolute truth that require no grammar or syntax to be fully understood. Profound secrets kept under lock and key, since before the foundation of the world, that vibrate directly within the core of the soul, communicating with the spirit, without the slightest need to pass through the imperfect and noisy filter of fleshly ears. To behold the ineffable is to contemplate a beauty so absolute and perfect that it causes not the slightest weariness to the eyes, but rather a constant renewal of vigor, breath, and mystical wonder. It is to plunge into a light that, being omnipresent, sovereign, and pure, allows for no shadows, for there is nothing in all the universe that can oppose its clarity or obstruct its reach. Paul finds himself in a sacred place where human duality and the weight of choices vanish, and where the question finds its full and satisfying answer even before it is formulated by conscious thought. Paradise reveals itself to him as the soul's true and only homeland, the place of origin from which we all came and to which we were designed to return after our exile in matter, in that instant that contains all time. The apostle experiences the indescribable ecstasy of finally feeling at home, free from all social masks, from all the fatigues of the earthly journey, and from the shackles of sin. He is surrounded by a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that cannot be defined merely as the absence of conflict, but rather as the total, active, protective, and filling presence of God himself. It is a harmony so vast and profound that every beat of his spiritual heart seems to resonate in perfect unison with the eternal hymn of creation and the cry of the seraphim. He understands that paradise is not just a geographic destination or a future reward, but a state of perfect communion where the Creator and the creature meet face to face, without any veil of separation or doubt. Paul drinks directly from a fountain of knowledge that renders all the sciences and philosophies of the earth mere child's play in the face of the overwhelming majesty of what he now knows with the clarity of angels. With every moment in this state, the weight of the real world grows lighter, while the substance of eternity becomes the only solid thing worthy of being sought, transforming his perception forever. The experience reaches its pinnacle not in a public proclamation, but in the solemn and insurmountable prohibition of speech. There arises, then, a question that has echoed through the centuries. Why is it that a man, having contemplated the face of eternity, is not permitted to recount in detail what he saw? The answer lies in the intrinsic nature of our mortal condition, for human language, with its limited alphabets and earthly syntax, is a crude tool that would only make a frustrated attempt to reduce the absolute infinite into finite and palatable concepts. The mystery of Paul's silence teaches us a profound lesson about the hierarchy of the sacred, revealing that the secret of the Lord is reserved exclusively for those who fear him and who know that true worship often dispenses with words altogether. There are truths so pure and so charged with divine electricity that they can only be fully lived in the intimacy of the Spirit, never described by a mouth of flesh without losing their very essence. To attempt to explain the magnitude of the third heaven using the vocabulary of the nations would be like trying to imprison the vastness of the ocean within a small cup of water, or trying to draw the sun using nothing but ashes. The imposed silence is not a punishment, but a necessary protection that guards the sanctity of the vision and keeps the mystery alive, preventing glory from being trivialized or turned into mere entertainment for curious minds. Paul carries with him, for the rest of his days, the invisible weight of a silent glory, an indelible mark engraved in the core of his soul that serves as a seal of authenticity. This silence screams louder than any sermon, declaring that heaven is a concrete and vibrant reality, but that its total fullness and complete understanding still await the glorious moment when we will all be transformed and endowed with new senses. He understands that certain revelations are not for the intellect, but for the sustenance of the soul in times of persecution, and that by remaining silent about what he heard, he is in truth honoring the majesty of the One who dwells in unapproachable light. The apostle becomes a guardian of mysteries, one who walks among men with the glow of another world in his eyes, but with lips sealed by a reverence that prefers the mysticism of experience over the noise of explanation, knowing that what is eternal does not fit within the margins of what is temporal. The descent from the spheres of absolute light into the dense world of matter represents the true moment of sacrifice and the most severe trial by fire for the apostle's soul. It is an abrupt and almost violent return from eternal paradise to damp, foul prisons. From the melodic hearing of ineffable words to the dry, biting sound of whips and the brutal impact of stones against a weary body, so that the breathtaking grandeur of the revelations received and the dizzying heights of the mysteries unveiled would not lead him to the dangerous precipice of arrogance or the sterile isolation of spiritual pride he was given by divine permission, a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan with the specific mission to buffet him continually and remind him, every second, of his limited condition as a dependent creature. This violent and constant contrast between the sublime ecstasy of the third heaven and the persistent agony of the flesh is the fundamental basis of spiritual maturity and true Christian character. The very man whose spiritual eyes touched the indescribable brilliance of the throne of God now feels, with disturbing clarity, the sharp, throbbing, and at times humbling pain of his own wounded and vulnerable humanity. Heaven, in its infinite and perfect wisdom, grants the vision so that the servant may have hope and know exactly where he is going. But the thorn is firmly maintained so that he never forgets who he is and upon whom he depends for every beat of his heart and every breath of life. We learn in this painful transition that God allows our deepest frailties and our unhealing wounds to remain, not as a form of abandonment or punishment, but as a sacred and pedagogical mechanism, so that His omnipotent strength may be our sole and exclusive daily sustenance. Paul's return to the exhaustive routine of suffering shipwrecks and relentless persecution should not be seen as a demotion of his spiritual standing or a step downward, but rather as a glorious mission to demonstrate to the visible and invisible universe that heaven can indeed dwell and shine intensely even within a man who suffers and who carries in his body the visible marks of pain. The thorn does not nullify or diminish the vision of paradise. On the contrary, it anchors it in the reality of service, renunciation, and total surrender, preventing the revelation received from becoming a burden of personal vanity. Thus, the apostle walks with feet wounded by the stony and hostile ground of the earth, yet with a soul completely filled by the absolute certainty of what he saw and heard on high, proving that true spirituality does not consist in fleeing from pain or denying humanity, but in courageously allowing the light of the eternal to shine through the cracks and fissures of our own weakness. It is in this paradox that Paul finds his greatest authority, for a man who has already seen heaven no longer fears the shadows of the earth. And a man who carries a thorn does not lose himself in his own glory, remaining focused only on the one who is the source of all consolation. We conclude this profound journey by understanding that the ultimate and absolute purpose of Paul's rapture to the third heaven was by no means to exalt the figure of the man or to create a caste of super-spiritual elites, but rather to glorify the sovereign grace that reaches the sinner in his smallness. The divine response to the Apostle's insistent and anguished cry for the final removal of the thorn is, in truth, the theological and spiritual pinnacle of this entire mystical experience, for in it, God reveals the secret that sustains the universe. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect and shines with greater intensity in your weakness. Paul returns from the celestial dimensions not with a technical manual of angelic descriptions, nor with detailed maps of the higher spheres to satisfy human curiosity, but with the unshakable and transformative certainty that God is absolutely sufficient to meet every lack of existence. The paradise he beheld and the ineffable words he heard are no longer just a distant memory, but they live and pulse within his being, granting him a supernatural courage to face death, time persecutions, and the limitations of the present life with the smile of one who already knows the end of the story. The heaven he visited became the fuel for his ministry on earth, allowing him to see every suffering as something light and momentary when compared to the eternal weight of glory revealed to him. May we all understand in the depths of our hearts that although we have not all been visibly caught up like the Apostle Paul, the exact same grace that he encountered and embraced in the heights is what sustains, guides, and strengthens us down here in our daily struggles. This vision teaches us that proximity to the sacred does not exempt us from battles, but equips us with an eternal perspective where the invisible becomes more real than the visible. We walk therefore with renewed hope, knowing that every tear and every pain serves as a backdrop for the power of God to manifest in us, until that glorious day when the veil of mortality will be torn forever, and we will no longer hear of paradise, but dwell within it, immersed forever in the light that Paul only glimpsed for a brief and eternal moment. The journey ends where true life begins, in total dependence on the one who loved us first, and who prepares a place for us where silence will finally become eternal praise, and weakness will be swallowed up by the victory of the life that never ends.
May this word take root in your spirit and guide your steps. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.